All right. Thanks for being here. Put on your thinking cap because today we're going to talk about psyops, and not just any psyop, but even more specifically, today we are going to talk about complex psyops. All right. So, first things first, what exactly is a psyop? A psyop is just a psyop, obviously, it means psychological operation. So, therefore, easily understood, it's an operation in which a significant intended effect is psychological. Now, that doesn't mean that it's the only intended effect. It can be some sort of other, operation that as you perform it, there's a significant psychological impact. I mean, it could then qualify as a psychological operation too. Or it could be something in which there's not necessarily some kind of overt act, and most of what is happening is merely psychological. So there are different types of psychological operations, and it's not necessarily my intent here to try and go through and explain all the different types of psychological operations or exactly what is or is not a psychological operation. So I'm hoping that if you're watching this video, you kind of at least understand the meaning of the term psyop, psychological operation. And if so, let's talk about how some of these can be quite sophisticated in nature. So, what we think of in terms of psychological operations, we to some degree have borrowed from the Germans. And there's a term that I actually use occasionally, which I like better than psychological operation because I think it's more comprehensive. And that term is worldview warfare. Now, the German word for that would be Weltanschauungskrieg. I don't speak German, but anyway, that's the word. It's a big, huge, long word like this long. But anyway, that word very literally translates in English to worldview warfare. And I like that term better than I do psychological operation, even though it's kind of where we got our term psychological operation from, or psychological warfare. I actually prefer the term worldview warfare because I think that it is a broader term, it's more comprehensive, and therefore more accurately descriptive of exactly what happens when they perform these types of operations against us. So think about what that means. Worldview warfare. You are attacking someone's worldview. So you're not just trying to influence their behavior. You're not even necessarily just trying to influence what they believe, but you are also trying to influence the way in which they arrive at those beliefs. In other words, you are absolutely attacking the way in which they view the world, the lens through which they understand the world so they can then make those decisions. But as you're doing so, you're attacking the very foundation of that worldview. In other words, the way in which they have come to believe what they believe and the way in which those beliefs construct their overall worldview. All right, so let's keep that in mind. So, what would a complex psyop be? Well, quite simply stated, this would be a psyop that has a lot of different moving parts, or there could be multiple layers to the psyop. And in fact, and this is what I think is kind of the key point here, it may also have competing narratives, or in other words, narratives that seem to be in contradiction with one another. And this is something I've talked about occasionally, or I've written on my Twitter account about this. But here's the way that I explain it, and I'm not saying that I'm an expert at understanding psychological operations or whatever, but I can tell you this: there are a lot of people out there who have no idea how to see through a psyop whatsoever, which is why we got to talk about this. So I say it like this: a complex psyop is not going to consist of just one narrative. Okay, it could consist of multiple narratives, but let's just think about a complex psyop in which you have two narratives. Okay, so in other words, you would have a primary narrative and you would have a counter narrative. And those two could be at least seemingly in opposition with one another. So now the public is confronted with these two competing narratives, and certain people will be so-called smart enough to resist the primary narrative and will then gravitate towards that other narrative that is waiting to receive them. And many of these people will actually chuckle derisively at those who can't see through the primary narrative, all the while they themselves are being captured by that counter narrative, which is equally inorganic. And at the end of the day, both the primary narrative and that alternate narrative, that counter narrative, are being run by the same folks, the same networks of power. And what they have done is they have crafted a well-constructed, dialectic in between these two seemingly contradictory narratives, and they have placed them in tension with one another. And this scheme is designed by those in power to move their agenda forward as the proponents of these two competing narratives are constantly fighting against each other. All right, so let's look at that one more time. So imagine a psyop that is complex enough that it's not just one fake narrative that is being run. Okay, imagine it as two narratives. Now, in a very complex psyop, you could have more than two narratives, but let's just think of it in terms of two: a primary narrative and then a counter narrative, or a secondary or alternate narrative. They seem to be contradictory. They expect many people to be smart enough to see through this primary narrative, but not necessarily smart enough to see through the counter narrative. Okay, so those who can't even see through the first one, they get wrapped up here. But plenty of other people can see through this one, but they get captured by the competing narrative. And what does that do? Forces people into two camps where some believe this, others believe this, and then they're constantly fighting with each other. So if you're familiar with the Hegelian dialectic, then you understand what I'm talking about here. And this is the one way in which those in power will move their agendas forward. If you're not familiar with the Hegelian dialectic, you can look that up. There are some very profound philosophical ways to kind of understand that, because it can get very, very, very dense. But you don't even necessarily have to be an expert at some of the extremely dense Hegelian philosophy that goes into that, or the philosophy of other individuals such as Kant or Fichte or whomever. You don't even necessarily have to worry about that. If you just have kind of a broad understanding of the Hegelian dialectic, you can see how they would use it to divide people into groups that are constantly in tension with each other in order to move an agenda forward in another direction. So let's take this understanding of complex psyops and let's look at some examples. So I'll give you two examples. And I'm going to read from you something that I wrote on Twitter, or X if you prefer. I prefer Twitter. But anyway, I'm going to read to you a post that I made on October 15th. So a couple of weeks prior to the election selection. All right, this is what I wrote. October 15th, 2024. I wrote this. Now think of when I read this, think about this in terms of what I just said about complex psyops. I get asked why I criticize Trump, but rarely mention Kamala. I believe Trump has already been selected to be the next POTUS. There's a sophisticated deception campaign to gain the people's consent by moving them toward him. Criticizing Trump applies pressure in the opposite direction of the ongoing election psyop, whereas criticizing Kamala applies pressure in the same direction as the psyop. A certain stimulus is applied, which is meant to elicit a response from the target. The response appears oppositional, but in reality, the target behaves in the exact way intended by those applying the stimulus all along. The target's own response, therefore, assists rather than resists the efforts of those applying the stimulus. That's why they have Trump running against an unelectable stooge. He's the decoy for people to focus their frustration on, so they'll predictably side with Trump. When you focus your ire on the decoy, you're wasting resources. If you support Kamala, then you're not even reacting to the initial stimulus, but instead are falling for the deception layer you're supposed to see through. The more sophisticated deception was lost on you. The complex deception campaign works because many Americans are smart enough to recognize Kamala as terrible, but not clever enough to resist siding with the other candidate conveniently offered. The support for Trump is being engineered. To get people to see the inconsistencies in supporting Trump is to push back against the PSYOP, whereas wasting resources on the decoy is to push in the same direction as the PSYOP. Okay, that's the end of that very long and kind of intricate post. What am I even saying here with all these words? Okay, again, you had Kamala, you had Trump. So a couple weeks before, election day, I said, hey, listen, I think they're going to put Trump in. I had thought that for like a year before, whatever. And so I was trying to explain, here's what I see happening. They're giving you a terrible candidate. Okay, this is Kamala. She's a terrible candidate on purpose. Why? Because they want you to side with Trump. They want you to consent to Trump being the next POTUS. So many people are attacking Kamala, but that's what they want. They want you to attack Kamala and then side with Trump. So what do? I don't attack Kamala. Why? Because that's an easy target. It's a waste of time. Of course, Kamala is terrible. If I have to tell you that Kamala is terrible, why am I wasting my time explaining that to you? You're lost. Sorry, you're lost. Okay. But plenty of people are smart enough to know that Kamala is terrible, but they still get wrapped up in Trump. And that's where I focus my attention because I want to push back against the PSYOP. I don't want to push along with the PSYOP. So in my mind, criticizing Kamala, which is a waste of time and resources, is to reinforce the PSYOP. To push back against Trump is to actually push back and resist the PSYOP. Okay. Hopefully you understand that, even if you disagree. And that's fine. I may think you're naive, but that's fine if you disagree. And if you do, you can let me know in the comments. But why am I bringing this up now? Because I think there's another complex PSYOP that has been going on for several years. So there's this whole thing going on right now with Epstein. All right, so I'm going to repeat something that I posted today on Twitter. And here's what I said. Me during the entire Epstein op, colon, and then I put like a yawn emoji. So what I was saying is, hey, this is me during the entire Epstein op, yawn, bored. Why? Because it's an op. It was always an op. It continues to be an op. It's so much of an op that the idea that it's an op is also an op because it's multi-layered. That's not to say that Epstein-like crimes don't occur. They certainly do and are far worse than we've been allowed to know. But the exposure story was deliberate, controlled, and limited. That continues to be the case. My thoughts for years have been that Epstein isn't dead. The "he killed himself" meme was so prevalent and pervasive that it was obvious to anyone who had eyes to see that they wanted you to think that not only was he dead, but also that he'd been killed to keep him from revealing whatever he knew. The official story that he killed himself was so intentionally laughable that you were supposed to reject it and therefore cling to the alternate narrative that he'd been offed. Many Americans dutifully rejected the primary narrative of suicide and thus bought the alternate narrative of murder, which is exactly what they wanted you to do the whole time. That's how sophisticated PSYOPs work. Also, did Epstein himself ever exist at all? Is he a real person? Is he a composite of multiple people? Is he merely an avatar meant to represent / push ideas they want to seed in our minds, like Elon is, in my view? Again, the Epstein type stories are very real and far short of the whole truth. However, the clown show drama that's been going on for 5+ years is intentionally theatrical and meant to be a mockery of these sick activities and public naivete about them. We haven't learned about these stories despite the best efforts of the deep state to cover them up, but precisely because the deep state has chosen to reveal what they have. If anyone does in fact end up prosecuted over all of this, it's because that too was intended. We've got to stop falling for obvious psyops and assuming they represent victories. So what's my point here in summation? We've got to understand how psyops work. They want to deceive us, but they also want to deceive us into giving our consent to what they're doing. So they often tell us, but they hide it. Sometimes they make it very obvious, and sometimes they hide it. Sometimes they tell us things in way. Sometimes they disclose truth in ways that they know that we'll reject because they make it so obvious. And other times they give us competing narratives, and both of them are false. But sometimes, despite the supposed complexity of these psyops, to me, they seem very obvious. Now, you might disagree with me because you might think that I'm wrong here. So you might say, well, you think it's obvious, but yet you're coming to the wrong conclusion. That's fine. You're free to disagree with me. Tell me all about it in the comments. I'm just telling you, this is my read on how some of these psyops work. And many of these psyops have multiple narratives. Some of the narratives look as if they are in tension with one another. But that doesn't mean that one is right and one is wrong. They could both be false. And there could be something else that is a third option that is out there that is the actual truth. So anyway, just maybe some points there that you could consider. I'm not saying I'm any smarter than anybody else, though. I guess I did say that if you support Kamala, then I think you're naive or whatever. That's true. I do. I do think you're naive. But if you support Trump, I also think you're naive. I'm not saying you're dumb, but I do think you're naive. And if you fall for some of these super obvious complex psyops, they can be complex and still be pretty obvious. Then yeah, I probably think that you're naive, and maybe you think I'm naive too, and that's cool. Doesn't mean that I think you're dumb. I think there are many, many, many intelligent people out there that still fall for this stuff, and that's why I just want to make this little video. What I'm saying is collectively, together, let's stop falling for this stuff. Let's help each other connect some dots, recognize some patterns. This goes back to the video that I made just recently about discernment. Let's help each other become better at discernment. Thanks for tuning in. I appreciate it.